Murder Beneath the Silver Moon.
Chapter 1. The Silver Moon Festival. The village of Silvermere lay quietly between dark forests and a wide, peaceful lake. It was the kind of place where little ever changed. The same stone cottages stood for generations. The same narrow paths wound through the fields, and the same villagers gathered in the small market square every morning. But Silvermere was known for one thing that drew visitors from distant towns: the lake. Silvermere Lake was famous for the strange beauty it showed on clear nights. When the moon was full, its light reflected across the water in such a way that the entire lake seemed to glow like polished silver. Locals called it the Silver Moon, and over the years it had become part of village legend. Every summer, when the full moon of July rose above the forest, the people of Silvermere celebrated the Silver Moon Festival. Lanterns were hung along the lakeside paths. Musicians played soft melodies near the old wooden pier. Children ran between the trees with laughter echoing through the warm evening air. Visitors arrived from neighboring towns to witness the glowing lake and enjoy the quiet charm of the village. That year's festival, however, carried a sense of curiosity and tension that had not been present before. Because a man had returned to Silvermere. A man many people had hoped never to see again. His name was Lord Henry Ashbourne. 20 years earlier, Henry Ashbourne had been nothing more than the ambitious son of a local merchant, but he had left the village suddenly, disappearing into the world beyond the quiet countryside. When he returned 2 decades later, he returned as something entirely different. He was now immensely wealthy. No one in Silvermere knew exactly how he had made his fortune. Some whispered about shipping investments, others mentioned mining contracts overseas. But there were darker rumors too, stories about ruined business partners, disappearing competitors, deals made in shadows rather than daylight. Yet despite the rumors, Henry Ashbourne had returned with confidence. He purchased the large stone estate overlooking Silvermere Lake and began hosting elegant gatherings for the villagers. Outwardly, he appeared generous. He donated money to the village church. He funded repairs to the old schoolhouse. He even sponsored the Silver Moon Festival that year. But many of the older villagers watched him with quiet suspicion. People who had known Henry long ago remembered something about him, something cold, something calculating. On the night of the festival, the lake shimmered beneath a perfect full moon. The surface of the water glowed softly as lantern light flickered along the shoreline. Guests wandered along the paths, admiring the reflection of the moon across the lake. Among them were several people who would soon find themselves at the center of a terrible mystery. Dr. Edward Halford, the village physician, walked slowly along the pier while speaking quietly with several guests. He was a tall, serious man with grey hair and careful manners. Nearby stood Miss Clara Bennet, the young schoolteacher, watching the lanterns floating across the water with quiet fascination. Not far from the lakeside path stood Thomas Reed, a fisherman whose weathered face showed years of hard work on the lake. And walking beside Lord Henry himself was his wife, Lady Margaret Ashbourne, a striking woman whose elegance attracted the attention of nearly every guest. Many villagers found her mysterious. Margaret Ashbourne had arrived in Silvermere only a year earlier when she married Henry. No one knew much about her past, but people whispered that she had not married for love. As the evening continued, laughter and music filled the air. The festival seemed peaceful and bright beneath the silver moon. Yet beneath the calm surface of the celebration, something else was beginning to stir. Several people noticed that Lord Henry Ashbourne appeared restless. He moved from group to group, speaking quietly to different guests. At times his voice seemed friendly. At other moments, however, those standing nearby noticed something darker in his tone. More than once, his conversations ended in tension. At one point, Dr. Halford walked away from him with a troubled expression. Later, Thomas Reed was seen speaking with Henry near the pier, their conversation growing heated before Reed stormed off toward the forest path. Even Lady Margaret appeared uneasy as she watched her husband from across the garden. Only one person seemed to observe everything with calm curiosity. A visitor who had arrived quietly in Silvermere earlier that week. Hercule Poirot. Poirot was not attending the festival as part of an investigation. He had come to the village simply for rest and quiet after finishing a difficult case in London. But a man like Poirot rarely ceased to observe the world around him. And Hercule Poirot had already begun to notice something strange. He noticed the tension between Henry Ashbourne and several villagers. He noticed the way certain conversations stopped when Henry approached. And most of all, he noticed the expression in Henry Ashbourne's eyes that evening. It was not the expression of a man celebrating a festival. It was the expression of a man who believed he held power over everyone around him. As midnight approached, the music softened, and many guests gathered along the lakeshore to watch the full moon reach its highest point above the forest. The reflection on the lake became brighter than ever. Silver light stretched across the water like a glowing path. For a moment, the entire village seemed wrapped in calm beauty. Then suddenly, a scream shattered the night. The sound came from the lakeside path near the willow trees. Guests turned in alarm. Lanterns swung as people rushed toward the sound. Poirot moved quickly through the crowd. When they reached the willow tree beside the water, the lantern light revealed a terrible sight. Lord Henry Ashbourne lay on the ground. A ceremonial silver dagger was buried deep in his chest. The blade glinted beneath the moonlight. For a moment, no one spoke. The music had stopped. The laughter had vanished. The festival of the silver moon had become something else entirely. Because beneath the glowing reflection of the moon on Silvermere Lake, a murder had just been committed. Chapter 2. The Body by the Water. For several long seconds after the scream, no one moved. The lanterns hanging from the willow branches swayed gently in the night wind, casting trembling circles of light across the ground. Beneath that unsteady glow lay the body of Lord Henry Ashbourne. The silver dagger was still lodged in his chest. The crowd slowly formed a silent ring around him. Some villagers gasped softly. Others whispered nervously to one another. A few simply stared in disbelief, as though their minds refused to accept what their eyes were seeing. Only moments earlier, the festival had been filled with music, laughter, and warm summer air. Now the night felt cold. Hercule Poirot stepped forward first. "Mes amis," he said quietly. "A little space, if you please." His voice was soft, yet it carried sufficient authority that the crowd obeyed almost immediately. Several villagers stepped backward, creating a wider circle around the body. Poirot knelt beside Henry Ashbourne. The moonlight reflected sharply on the dagger's polished blade. It was not an ordinary weapon. The handle was engraved with delicate patterns and decorated with small silver leaves. Poirot recognized it at once. It was one of the ceremonial daggers placed earlier that evening on the festival table, decorative only. At least that had been the intention. They had been part of the traditional display honoring the old legends of Silvermere. No one had expected one of them to become a real weapon. He carefully studied the body. Henry Ashbourne lay on his back near the roots of the willow tree. His coat was still buttoned neatly. One hand rested against the ground, while the other lay open beside him. His face showed something unusual, not fear, not pain, surprise, as if the moment of death had come unexpectedly. as if he had recognized the person standing before him and had not believed that person capable of striking. Poirot touched the man's wrist gently. The skin was already cold. "He's dead," he said simply. A murmur passed through the crowd. Lady Margaret Ashbourne pushed forward through the villagers. When she saw the body, her face turned pale. "Oh God," she whispered. She covered her mouth with one hand and took a step backward, as though the sight itself had struck her. Dr. Edward Halford quickly moved beside the detective. "Let me see," he said quietly. Poirot rose slightly and allowed the doctor space. Halford bent over the body and examined the wound carefully. After only a few seconds, he sighed and straightened. "The blade entered the heart," he said. "Death would have been almost immediate." Several villagers looked away. The peaceful festival had suddenly become a crime scene. Poirot rose slowly and examined the ground around the body. The soil near the willow tree was soft from rain earlier in the week. If there had been a struggle, there ought to have been clear signs. But there were none. No overturned dirt, no broken branches, no marks of panic or resistance. The ground was strangely undisturbed. "That is curious," Poirot murmured. "What is curious?" asked Dr. Halford. "There has been no struggle." The doctor frowned slightly. "Then the attack was sudden. Or," said Poirot gently, "Lord Ashbourne did not fear the person who approached him." The crowd shifted uneasily at those words. Thomas Reed stood at the edge of the lantern light with his arms folded tightly across his chest. Clara Bennet stood nearby, her eyes wide with shock. Lady Margaret remained motionless, staring at her husband's body as though she could not quite believe what had happened. Poirot walked slowly toward the edge of the lake. The water shimmered beneath the moon, calm and undisturbed. The reflection of the silver light stretched across the surface like a narrow, glowing road. He studied the narrow path beside the willow trees. There were footprints in the soft earth, but far too many to distinguish clearly. Dozens of festival guests had walked through the area during the evening. Any clear pattern had already been destroyed. Then something caught his eye. Henry Ashbourne's shoes, polished black shoes, spotless and clean. Poirot crouched beside the body once more and examined them carefully. No mud, no wet soil, which meant Henry Ashbourne had not wandered through the damp garden paths. He had come directly to this spot, as if he had planned to meet someone here. Poirot rose and turned slowly toward the crowd. "Who discovered the body first?" he asked. A nervous village boy raised his hand. "I heard the scream," the boy said. "I thought someone had fallen." "Did you see anyone leaving the place?" The boy shook his head quickly. "No, sir. When we came, he was already like this." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Did anyone see Lord Ashbourne shortly before the scream?" For a moment, no one answered. Then Clara Bennet spoke quietly. "I saw him perhaps 10 minutes earlier." "Where?" "Near the lantern table. He was speaking to someone." "To whom?" "I could not see clearly," she admitted. "There were too many people." Thomas Reed then said, from behind the crowd, "I saw him walking toward the lake." Poirot turned toward him. "Alone?" "Yes." "And what time was that?" "Just before the moon reached its highest point." Poirot glanced upward. The moon still hung high above the forest, which meant the murder had occurred only minutes earlier. He looked slowly around the villagers one by one, faces pale in lantern light, eyes watching, whispers passing quietly through the crowd. Any of them might have done it. And somewhere in that silent circle, Poirot thought quietly, the killer was surely watching him already. Chapter 3. Secrets in Silvermere. Morning came slowly over Silvermere. The silver glow of the previous night had vanished, replaced by low grey cloud hanging heavily above the lake. The cheerful festival lanterns still dangled from tree branches along the shoreline, but in the pale daylight they looked dull and strangely out of place beside the quiet water where murder had been done. The villagers moved about the streets in subdued silence. Small groups gathered near the market square and along the lakeside paths, speaking in hushed voices. News travelled quickly in a village, and by sunrise everyone knew what had happened beneath the willow trees. Lord Henry Ashbourne was dead, and somewhere in Silvermere the person responsible still walked freely among them. Hercule Poirot had already begun his work. He had risen early and taken a quiet walk through the village before most people had left their homes. From long experience he understood something important about places like Silvermere. Villages had a way of appearing peaceful and harmonious. People greeted one another politely. They shared meals, attended church together, and celebrated the same traditions year after year. But beneath that pleasant surface there could live many quiet resentments. Old quarrels, unspoken rivalries, secrets that had remained buried for years. And Poirot suspected that Silvermere held more than its share. It did not take him long to discover that Lord Henry Ashbourne had not been beloved at all. Quite the opposite. Years earlier, Henry had returned wealthy enough to purchase much of the land surrounding Silvermere Lake. As at first the villagers had welcomed him warmly. They believed his fortune would bring prosperity to the region. New businesses, better fishing rights, improved roads and trade. But prosperity had not arrived. Instead, Henry Ashbourne had begun quietly buying property across the village. Small farms changed ownership. Fishing licenses were transferred. Old woodland paths were suddenly declared private land. Several families found themselves forced to sell property that had belonged to their ancestors for generations. At first, these transactions seemed ordinary, but as time passed, a troubling pattern emerged. Businesses that resisted selling to Henry Ashbourne suddenly faced financial difficulties. Contracts were cancelled, taxes increased, loans were unexpectedly withdrawn, and one by one, the properties eventually fell into Ashbourne's hands. Poirot listened carefully as these stories were repeated in different forms by several villagers. There was bitterness beneath their calm voices and resentment that had been quietly building for years. One man who had suffered especially was Thomas Reed. Poirot found the fisherman standing beside the wooden pier, staring silently across the lake. The morning wind moved gently across the water, creating small ripples that spread toward the shore. Reed did not look surprised when Poirot approached him. "You had business troubles with Lord Ashbourne?" Poirot asked calmly. Reed gave a short, bitter laugh. "He bought the lake rights," the fisherman said. "Fishing rights?" Reed nodded. "My family worked these waters for 40 years. My father fished here. My grandfather fished here." He looked down toward the quiet water. "Then Ashbourne bought the licenses. And after that? My boat became useless." His voice remained calm, but the bitterness beneath it was unmistakable. "And you argued with him last night?" Poirot asked. "Yes." "The lake?" "The lake." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. A powerful motive. But Reed was not the only villager with reason to resent Henry Ashbourne. Later that morning, Poirot visited the small medical clinic near the village square. Dr. Edward Halford received him politely, though there was tension behind the doctor's careful manners. "You had disagreements with Lord Ashbourne?" Poirot asked. Halford hesitated before answering. "Yes." "Professional disagreements?" "In a way." The doctor adjusted his glasses nervously. "Ashbourne accused my clinic of using treatments he believed questionable." "Were they?" Halford frowned slightly. "My work sometimes involves experimental methods," he admitted, "but everything I do is intended to help patients." And Ashbourne threatened to expose you? Halford remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he nodded. Yes. Another resentment, another person who had reason to fear Henry Ashbourne's influence. But perhaps the most curious situation involved Lady Margaret Ashbourne. Poirot had watched her carefully during the previous night's discovery of the body. Her reaction had certainly been shock, but there had also been something else in her expression, something almost like relief. Later that morning, Poirot spoke with Clara Bennet, the village schoolteacher. Clara had lived in Silvermere her entire life and knew nearly every family in the community. "What do people say about Lady Margaret?" Poirot asked. Clara hesitated before answering. "They say she married Lord Ashbourne for money." "Do you believe that?" "I don't know," Clara said quietly. "But their marriage never seemed happy." Poirot nodded slowly. The picture of Henry Ashbourne was becoming clearer. A wealthy man, a powerful man, and a deeply disliked one. But there was something else. As Poirot continued speaking with villagers, several people mentioned the same curious detail. Henry Ashbourne had argued with different people throughout the festival evening. One villager had seen him speaking sharply with Thomas Reed near the pier. Another remembered raised voices between Ashbourne and Dr. Halford beside the lantern table. Someone else claimed to have seen a tense conversation between Henry and his own wife near the garden path. It was almost as though Ashbourne had spent the entire evening provoking people, challenging them, reminding them of his power. Poirot walked slowly once more along the lakeside path where the murder had taken place. The willow branches moved gently above the quiet water. The village church bell rang faintly somewhere in the distance. Henry Ashbourne had many enemies, too many, and that suggested something dangerous. Poirot folded his hands behind his back as he looked across the lake. Because when a man creates resentment everywhere he goes, he does not create one possible murderer, he creates many. Chapter 4. The Moonlight Meeting. By midday, Hercule Poirot had begun to see a pattern. The arguments, the tension, the uneasy glances exchanged whenever Henry Ashbourne approached someone during the festival. None of it had been accidental. What had seemed at first like a series of unpleasant conversations now appeared to be part of something carefully arranged. Henry Ashbourne had not simply been attending the festival. He had been preparing for something. Poirot sat quietly in the drawing room of Ashbourne's estate, examining a set of papers that had been found inside Henry's writing desk. The room itself was large and elegant, but there was little warmth in its decoration. The polished furniture and expensive paintings spoke of wealth rather than comfort. The housekeeper had reluctantly allowed Poirot to examine the study. And there, inside a leather writing folder, he had discovered something very interesting. 4 letters. Each letter had been sealed carefully in an envelope bearing Henry Ashbourne's handwriting. Each envelope was addressed to a different person in the village. Poirot unfolded the first letter. It was written in a firm, precise hand. "Dr. Halford, there are matters we must discuss privately. I suggest you meet me tonight at midnight beside the willow tree near the lake. The subject concerns information that may affect your professional reputation. H. Ashbourne." Poirot folded the letter again and placed it neatly on the desk. The second letter was addressed to Clara Bennet. "Miss Bennet, it has come to my attention that you possess certain opinions regarding my business affairs. I believe we should discuss this matter privately before such opinions become widely known. Meet me at midnight beside the willow tree by the lake. H. I. Ashbourne." Poirot's moustache twitched thoughtfully. The third letter had been written to Thomas Reed. "Mr. Reed, your continued complaints regarding the fishing rights have grown tiresome. Nevertheless, there may still be a solution that benefits us both. Meet me tonight at midnight by the willow tree beside the lake. H. Ashbourne. Finally, there was the fourth letter. This one was addressed to Lady Margaret Ashbourne. Margaret, there are certain matters concerning our marriage which can no longer be ignored. I believe it would be wise for us to discuss them privately. Meet me tonight at midnight beside the lake. Henry. Poirot leaned back slowly in his chair. 4 letters. 4 private invitations. Each one carefully written to suggest urgency. Each one implying that the meeting must remain secret, which meant something very important. Henry Ashbourne had arranged for 4 different people to meet him at exactly the same place, at exactly the same time. One by one, Poirot questioned them. Dr. Edward Halford was the first. The physician sat stiffly across from Poirot, adjusting his glasses nervously. "You received this letter yesterday?" Poirot asked, placing the paper on the table. "Yes." "And you went to meet Lord Ashbourne?" "I did." "What happened when you arrived?" Halford sighed slightly. "He was waiting beside the willow tree. He spoke very calmly, almost too calmly." "And what did he say?" "He suggested that certain treatments I had used in the past might appear, questionable if the wrong people examined them." "A threat?" Halford nodded reluctantly. "Yes." "And when did you leave him?" "Shortly before midnight." "And he was alive?" "Yes." Poirot thanked him politely. The next conversation was with Clara Bennet. The young schoolteacher looked deeply uncomfortable discussing the letter. "I didn't want anyone to see it," she admitted quietly. "What did Lord Ashbourne say when you met him?" "He accused me of interfering in matters that did not concern me." "What matters?" "His business dealings in the village." "And then?" "He warned me that speaking publicly about those matters might damage my reputation." "Did you argue?" "Yes." "And when you left him?" "He was still standing beside the tree." Poirot nodded. Thomas Reed was less patient with questioning. "Yes, I got the letter," the fisherman said bluntly. "Yes, I went." "And yes, we argued." "About the lake?" Reed nodded. "Or he said the fishing rights would never return to the village." "What time did you leave?" "Just before midnight." "And Ashbourne?" "Still alive." Finally, Poirot spoke with Lady Margaret. She sat beside the tall window of the drawing-room, staring out toward the lake. "Did you meet your husband last night?" Poirot asked gently. "Yes." "What did he want?" Her voice was quiet. "He said our marriage had become inconvenient." Poirot raised an eyebrow slightly. "Inconvenient?" "He suggested we might soon separate." "And when you left him?" "Just before midnight." "And he was alive?" "Yes." When the final interview ended, Poirot stood slowly and walked toward the window. Outside, the lake lay still beneath the pale afternoon sky. The willow trees moved gently in the breeze. Henry Ashbourne had arranged not one meeting, but 4. He had carefully ensured that each person believed they were alone with him. He had provoked them, threatened them, angered them. It was almost as though he had deliberately created enemies. Poirot folded his hands behind his back and gazed across the quiet water. But there was a problem. If all 4 suspects spoke the truth, and Poirot suspected that they did, then Henry Ashbourne had been alive when each of them walked away. Which meant someone else had approached the willow tree afterward. Someone who had not received a letter. Someone who had not been expected. Someone Henry Ashbourne had not planned for. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly, because the final visitor to the willow tree was the key to the entire mystery. Chapter 5. The Night of Confrontation. That evening, Hercule Poirot gathered the four of them in the drawing room of the Ashbourne estate. The room was large but strangely oppressive. The tall windows looked out toward the dark lake, where the silver moon had begun to rise once again above the distant forest. A small fire burned quietly in the hearth, though the summer air was still warm. The atmosphere inside the room, however, was far from comfortable. Dr. Halford stood near the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Clara Bennet stood beside the tall window, staring down toward the garden paths as though she wished to be anywhere else. Thomas Reed remained near the door, his broad shoulders tense, his arms folded firmly across his chest. Lady Margaret Ashbourne sat in an armchair near the centre of the room. Her face was pale, but her posture remained carefully composed. Hercule Poirot stood before them. For several moments he said nothing. He simply studied their faces one by one. Then he spoke. "Lord Ashbourne did not invite you for conversation," he said quietly. "He invited you because he possessed power over you." No one answered. But silence, Poirot reflected, is often as revealing as speech. The quiet in the room deepened. Poirot folded his hands together and continued calmly. Monsieur Ashbourne was a man who enjoyed power. Power over property, power over reputation, power over people. He looked slowly from one face to another. And each of you believed he possessed something that could harm you. Still no one spoke. Then Poirot said a single name. Daniel Reed. The effect was immediate. Thomas Reed stiffened as though struck. Clara Bennet lowered her eyes. Dr. Halford shifted uneasily beside the fireplace. Lady Margaret's hands trembled slightly in her lap. Poirot nodded softly. "Yes," he said, "we must speak about Daniel Reed." The name had clearly not been spoken in this house for a long time. The silence stretched for several seconds before Thomas Reed spoke at last. "My son died 5 years ago," he said quietly. "Yes," said Poirot gently. "So I understand. It was an accident. Was it?" Reed did not answer. Poirot turned toward Dr. Halford. "You were the physician who examined the body, I believe." Halford cleared his throat nervously. "Yes." And the official report concluded that Daniel Reed slipped from the cliffs during a storm. "Yes." Poirot studied him carefully. "Yet you do not sound entirely convinced of that explanation, Doctor." Halford looked down at the floor. "It was a terrible night," he said slowly. "The wind was strong, the rain heavy, visibility was poor. Nevertheless," Poirot said quietly, "several people were present." Clara Bennet spoke softly. "Yes." Poirot turned toward her. "You were there?" Clara nodded. "I heard shouting near the lake. When I went outside, Daniel and Henry were already arguing." "What were they arguing about?" Clara hesitated. Finally, she answered. Daniel had discovered something. Poirot raised his eyebrows slightly. "What had he discovered?" Dr. Halford answered reluctantly. "Financial records." "Records of what nature?" "Illegal land purchases," Halford said quietly. "Documents that proved Henry Ashbourne had forced several villagers to sell their property unlawfully." Poirot nodded. "And Daniel Reed intended to reveal these documents?" "Yes." The detective looked toward Thomas Reed. That must have made Lord Ashbourne very angry. The fisherman's voice was low and bitter. "Henry confronted my son near the cliffs." "And then?" "There was an argument." Clara Bennet continued the story. "Daniel tried to leave." "Where did he go?" "Toward the cliff path." "And Ashbourne followed him?" "Yes." Poirot glanced toward the others. "You all followed as well?" Halford nodded slowly. "Yes." "What happened next?" For several seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Halford said quietly, "We arrived just as Daniel slipped." "Into the water below?" "Yes." Thomas Reed's voice broke slightly. "The storm was terrible that night." Poirot studied their faces carefully. "And none of you attempted a rescue?" Clara shook her head slowly. "The waves were too violent." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. The story had clearly been told many times before, but something about it remained incomplete. Still, one fact had now become very clear. Lord Henry Ashbourne had possessed a secret that connected every person in this room to Daniel Reed's death. And for 5 years he had used that secret to control them. Poirot spoke quietly again. "On the night of the Silver Moon Festival, Lord Ashbourne decided to remind each of you what he knew." Thomas Reed's expression darkened. "He threatened us," he said. Dr. Halford nodded. "He said if we refused his demands, he would reveal the truth about Daniel." "And that," said Poirot calmly, "is why you all went to meet him beside the willow tree at midnight." Clara Bennet nodded slowly. "Yes." "And during those meetings," Poirot continued, "he made his threats clear. Lady Margaret finally spoke. He said our lives would be destroyed." Poirot looked at each of them again. "And yet," he said quietly, "when each of you left the lakeside—" "He was still alive," Halford said quickly. "Yes," said Poirot softly. That part of their story remained perfectly consistent. Henry Ashbourne had been alive when each of them walked away. Poirot walked slowly toward the window. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath the rising moon. Henry Ashbourne had enemies, many enemies, but none of those enemies had killed him, which left only one question remaining. Poirot turned slowly back toward the room. If these four were telling the truth, then someone else had come to the willow tree after they departed. Someone unseen, someone unexpected, someone who had arrived last. Chapter 6. The Impossible Murder. That night, Hercule Poirot stood alone beneath the willow tree. The festival had ended hours earlier, the lanterns had been extinguished, the musicians had gone home, and the village of Silvermere had fallen into uneasy silence. Only the lake remained awake. Its dark surface reflected the rising moon in long, pale streaks of light, and the willow branches moved softly in the night breeze. Poirot stood with his hands behind his back, gazing at the exact spot where Lord Henry Ashbourne had died. The earth still showed faint marks from the investigation earlier that morning. The soil had been disturbed by the villagers who gathered after the body was discovered, leaving a confused pattern of footprints that told very little. But Poirot was not discouraged. His little grey cells were working, but he replayed the events of the night carefully. First came Dr. Halford, then Clara Bennet, then Thomas Reed, and finally Lady Margaret. Each had admitted meeting Ashbourne beside the willow tree. Each had admitted confronting him, each had reason to hate him, and yet each had insisted on the same crucial detail. When they left him, Henry Ashbourne was still alive. Poirot believed them, not because they were trustworthy people, but because their stories matched too closely to be invented. Each person described Ashbourne standing beside the tree, angry but unharmed when they departed. And witnesses at the festival had confirmed something equally important. All four had returned to the lantern-lit paths shortly afterward, which meant none of them had remained long enough to commit the murder. Poirot looked up at the moon thoughtfully. "So," he murmured softly to himself, "we have the impossible murder." The killer had not been one of the four, and yet the festival grounds had been filled with people. Lanterns had illuminated the main paths around the lake, Music had played beside the wooden pier. Guests had wandered through the gardens. If someone had walked openly from the crowd toward the willow tree, someone would have noticed. Yet no one had. Poirot crouched slowly near the ground and studied the soil again. There were footprints, yes, but they overlapped one another in such confusion that identifying a single path was nearly impossible. But something else remained curious. There had been no sign of struggle. Henry Ashbourne had not attempted to run. He had not cried out. He had not even defended himself, which suggested something very specific. He had recognized the person who approached him. Poirot straightened slowly. His eyes moved across the dark lake, then suddenly something in his mind shifted. He turned toward the water. Throughout the festival evening, the majority of guests had remained near the lantern-lit paths that curved around the gardens. Very few people had ventured toward the darker shoreline. In fact, the only people regularly using that part of the lake had been the fishermen earlier in the day, and the small boats tied beside the pier. Poirot walked slowly toward the wooden pier. The lake lapped quietly against the wooden posts as he stepped onto the planks. The faint creaking of the wood echoed softly across the water. 3 small boats were tied there. 2 appeared dry and undisturbed. But the third one caught Poirot's attention immediately. The sides of the boat were damp. Not from the evening dew, from recent use. Poirot leaned forward slightly and examined the interior. Inside the boat lay a small object. A silver chain. Attached to the chain was a delicate pendant shaped like a crescent moon. Poirot lifted it carefully. The moonlight glinted on the polished surface of the pendant. For a moment, he simply held it in his hand. Then a faint, sad smile appeared beneath his moustache. "Yes," he murmured quietly. "I have seen this before." The realization settled into place with quiet certainty. The killer had not come from the crowd. The killer had not walked along the lantern paths. The killer had come from the lake, by boat, approaching the dark shoreline where no one was watching, approaching a man who believed himself safe because he was expecting someone else. Poirot returned slowly to the willow tree. The branches rustled softly above him. Now the entire sequence became clear. The 4 suspects had confronted Henry Ashbourne. They had argued, they had left. And then, sometime afterward, another visitor had arrived, a visitor who had approached silently across the dark water, a visitor who carried the ceremonial dagger taken earlier from the festival display, a visitor who had known exactly where to find Henry Ashbourne. Poirot closed his hand gently around the silver pendant. The crescent moon reflected faintly in the lake beside him. He knew now who the killer was. But knowing the truth was only the beginning, because the final step remained. The truth must be revealed. And so Poirot turned slowly away from the lake and walked back toward the quiet village. Tomorrow night, beneath the same silver moon, he would ask one final person to meet him beside the willow tree. And there, the mystery of Henry Ashbourne's death would finally be solved. Chapter 7. The Shocking Truth. The following evening, the villagers of Silvermere gathered once more beside the lake. But this time the atmosphere was very different. The lanterns that had once lit the festival paths were gone. The musicians had not returned. No laughter echoed among the willow trees. Only the quiet water of Silvermere Lake stretched beneath the pale silver moon. The villagers stood in uneasy silence near the place where Lord Henry Ashbourne had been found dead. Hercule Poirot had asked them to come, and when Poirot asked for a gathering, people came. Dr. Edward Halford stood near the wooden pier, his expression tense and thoughtful. Clara Bennet stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly together. Lady Margaret Ashbourne stood slightly apart from the others, her face pale but composed. Thomas Reed remained near the edge of the gathering, his broad figure half hidden in shadow, and beside him stood his daughter, Emily Reed. She was a slight girl of 16 with dark hair and watchful eyes. She stood quietly, saying nothing, observing everything. Poirot stepped forward slowly. The moonlight reflected on the still surface of the lake behind him. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply allowed the silence to settle across the group. Then he began. "Mes amis," he said gently, "we have gathered here to understand the truth about Lord Henry Ashbourne's death." No one moved. "Yesterday I explained that 4 people came here during the night of the festival." He turned his gaze toward them. "Dr. Halford, Miss Bennet, Monsieur Reed, Lady Margaret." Each of them stood very still. "You each received a letter inviting you to meet Lord Ashbourne privately beneath this willow tree." Poirot gestured lightly toward the branches above them. "And each of you believed the meeting was secret." Clara Bennet spoke quietly. "Yes, but it was not secret," Poirot continued. "It was carefully arranged." He folded his hands behind his back. "Lord Ashbourne invited each of you separately because he wished to frighten you." Poirot looked slowly at Halford. "You, Doctor, were threatened with the exposure of your medical practices." Then toward Clara. "You were threatened with scandal." Then Thomas Reed. "You were threatened with the loss of your family's livelihood." Finally he turned toward Lady Margaret. "And you, Madame, were threatened with humiliation and ruin." The silence around them deepened. Lord Ashbourne believed he possessed a secret that gave him power over all of you. Poirot paused. "That secret concerned the death of Daniel Reed." Thomas Reed lowered his head. Poirot continued gently. 5 years ago, Daniel discovered evidence of Henry Ashbourne's illegal dealings. During a stormy night, he confronted Ashbourne near this very lake. Clara Bennet spoke softly. "There was an argument." "Yes." Poirot nodded. "Daniel fled toward the cliffs. Ashbourne followed. Others arrived too late to prevent what happened next." Thomas Reed's voice was barely audible. "My son fell into the water." Poirot looked at him kindly. "Yes. And though the death was ruled an accident, the truth was never fully spoken." The villagers listened in silence. For 5 years, Henry Ashbourne used that secret to control those who had witnessed the event. Poirot turned slowly toward the group again. "And on the night of the Silver Moon Festival, he decided to remind them of that power." Dr. Halford spoke quietly. "He threatened us again." "Yes. And each of you came here to confront him." Poirot nodded toward the willow tree. "One by one you argued with him. But when you left, he was still alive," Clara whispered. "Exactly." Poirot's voice grew softer. "Which means that after all 4 of you had gone," he turned slowly toward the girl standing beside Thomas Reed, "someone else remained." The villagers followed his gaze. Emily Reed stood perfectly still. Poirot looked at her kindly. "Lord Ashbourne made one fatal mistake," he said. "He believed only the invited would come." The girl did not move. Emily Reed overheard Lord Ashbourne threatening her father. Thomas Reed's head lifted sharply. Poirot continued gently. "She knew the truth about her brother Daniel." At last Emily spoke. Her voice was very quiet. "My brother tried to run." Poirot nodded. "Yes, and Lord Ashbourne allowed him to drown." Tears shone faintly in the girl's eyes, but her voice remained steady. "I heard him threatening my father the same way." The villagers listened without breathing. So you followed him? Emily nodded slowly. I watched from the trees while the others argued with him. Poirot continued the story softly. You saw Dr. Halford leave, then Miss Bennet, then your father, then Lady Margaret. Emily whispered, Yes. And when they had all gone, Poirot paused. You remained? The girl looked down at the ground. He turned his back, she said quietly, and I stabbed him. A broken sound escaped from Thomas Reed, but Emily did not look at him. I used the festival dagger, she continued, and then I left by the boat. Poirot held up the small silver crescent necklace. This was left in the boat. Emily looked at it silently. That is mine. The villagers murmured softly among themselves, because suddenly everything made sense. The boat, the silent approach from the lake, the absence of witnesses, the lack of struggle, all of it. Poirot lowered the necklace slowly. The killer did not come from the crowd. He looked gently at Emily. The killer came from the lake. And in that moment, the impossible crime became something far simpler. Not a clever plot, not a calculated murder, but a terrible act born from grief, anger, and the long shadow of cruelty. Chapter 8. Murder Beneath the Silver Moon. For a long moment after Emily's confession, no one spoke. The villagers stood quietly beneath the willow trees, their faces pale in the cold silver light of the moon. The branches rustled softly above them, whispering in the night breeze. Behind them, Silvermere Lake shimmered peacefully, its calm surface reflecting the pale glow of the sky just as it had on the night of the festival. Yet everything in Silvermere felt different now. The beauty of the lake, once a source of pride and celebration for the village, now seemed to carry a deeper and more complicated meaning. The laughter and music of the festival felt distant and unreal, replaced by the heavy weight of truth that had finally been revealed. Emily Reed stood beside her father, trembling slightly. The courage that had allowed her to speak had begun to fade, leaving her pale and exhausted. Her hands were clasped tightly together as though she feared they might betray her emotions. But she had not run, she had not hidden, and she had not denied what she had done. Thomas Reed slowly placed a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. His rough fisherman's hand rested there gently, almost as if he feared she might disappear if he let go. His eyes were filled with grief, but also with something deeper, something like understanding. The villagers watched them in silence. Some of them looked shocked, some looked saddened, and a few, though they would never say it aloud, seemed almost relieved that the long shadow of Henry Ashbourne's cruelty had finally ended. Hercule Poirot regarded father and daughter with grave sympathy. The small Belgian detective stood quietly for a moment before speaking. Emily did not come here with the plan of a murderer, he said softly. She came as a child who had seen too much sorrow. His voice carried gently across the lakeside clearing. He turned slowly to face the villagers gathered beneath the willow branches. For many years, Poirot continued, Lord Henry Ashbourne used fear as his weapon. He paused briefly, allowing the truth of that statement to settle among them. He destroyed livelihoods through ruthless dealings. He forced families from their homes, and he held secrets over the heads of those who opposed him. Dr. Halford lowered his gaze. Clara Bennet looked away toward the dark water. Even Lady Margaret Ashbourne closed her eyes for a moment. Poirot continued quietly. He believed that fear would protect him, that his wealth and influence would allow him to threaten others without consequence. Poirot slowly turned toward the lake. The silver moonlight stretched across the water like a path of pale light leading into the distance. But fear, he said thoughtfully, is a dangerous weapon. He folded his hands behind his back. It breeds despair. It breeds anger. His voice softened. And sometime, alas, it breeds justice of the wild and terrible kind. The villagers remained silent. No one argued. No one protested, because deep in their hearts they knew he spoke the truth. Henry Ashbourne had not been a man who inspired loyalty. He had inspired resentment. He had created enemies wherever he went. And eventually, one of those enemies had answered him. Poirot turned back toward the gathering. Lord Henry Ashbourne was not killed by a stranger, he said quietly. Not by a hired assassin. Not by a cold and calculating criminal. He looked gently at Emily Reed. He was killed by the consequence of his own cruelty. The girl lowered her head. Thomas Reed's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. The lake shimmered softly beneath the moon, the silver light dancing across the water like scattered stars. Poirot gazed out across the quiet surface. Lord Henry Ashbourne created enemies everywhere he went, he said slowly. And beneath this silver moon, he paused for a moment. One of those enemies finally answered him. The villagers stood motionless beneath the willow trees. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly across the dark forest. The festival of Silvermere would never feel the same again. For years, the village had celebrated the beauty of the silver moon reflected across the lake. But now that moon would carry different memories. Memories of Daniel Reed, memories of secrets that had poisoned the village for years, and memories of the night when truth had finally risen to the surface. The lake itself seemed to hold those memories now. Its calm waters reflected the sky as though nothing had ever disturbed it. But the people of Silvermere would remember, because beneath the silver moon, the truth had been revealed. And the moon, shining serenely above it all, had witnessed everything from the very beginning.
If you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe. Also let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. I'd love to know.